This hearing is called to order. Good afternoon. We'll ask for the senator from Colorado to stop being unruly. Welcome to our witnesses. Welcome, everyone. The International Space Station is the largest and most complex habitable space-based research facility ever constructed by humanity. It's a marvel of engineering, and it's critically important to our national space program. For over 17 years, the ISS has provided the United States with continuous access to low Earth orbit, which has been paramount to the success of NASA, our commercial partners, scientific research, and to human space exploration. It's due to the significance of the ISS as a key component of our national space program that this subcommittee led the effort that extended the operation of ISS to 2024 by enacting the bipartisan U.S. Commercial Space Launch Competitiveness Act in 2015, which Senator Nelson and I worked on hand in hand, and which was signed into law by President Obama. We then followed up on that effort by once again working in a bipartisan manner, me working closely once again with Senator Nelson, in enacting the NASA Transition Authorization Act of 2017, which was signed into law by President Trump and established the ISS transition principles. The purpose of the ISS transition principles was to create a stepwise approach to eventually transition from the ISS once there is the emergence of a proven and reliable commercial alternative. Congress decided to take a stepwise approach due to the long history at NASA in which major programs like Constellation and the Space Shuttle had been eliminated prematurely. These decisions have long-term repercussions at NASA. Its workforce, the local communities surrounding NASA centers, and American taxpayers who face increased replacement costs for lost capabilities. Not only was it concerning when NASA failed to deliver the ISS transition report to Congress before December 1st, 2017, as required by federal law, but it was deeply troubling when reports leaked that some were pushing a proposal to end all federal funding of ISS, but in 2025. Congress was explicitly clear in making its long-term interest in ISS known in the NASA Transition Authorization Act of 2017. Federal statute required the transition plan to include cost estimates for extending operation of the ISS to 2024, to 2028, and to 2030. It also required an evaluation of the feasible and preferred service life of the ISS through at least 2028 as a unique scientific, commercial, and space exploration-related facility. Nowhere in federal statute is there a request from Congress seeking a hard deadline to end federal support for ISS, to cross our fingers and hope for the best. We've seen that act play out too many times in our national space program, and it's time we learn the lessons of history. Prematurely canceling a program for political reasons costs jobs and wastes billions of dollars. We cannot afford to continue to pursue policies that have consequences of creating gaps in capability, that send $3.5 billion in taxpayer money to the Russian government, or that create a leadership vacuum in low Earth orbit that provides a window of opportunity for the Chinese to capitalize upon. Let me be clear. As long as I am chairman of this subcommittee, the ISS will continue to have strong support, strong bipartisan support in the United States Congress. And as long as Article 1 of the Constitution remains intact, it will be Congress that is the final arbiter of how long ISS receives federal funding. I'd now like to recognize the ranking member of the full committee, Senator Nelson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Indeed, what we have is $100 billion or more investment in low Earth orbit. It took, ever since we started assembling the space station years ago, this incredible flying machine, the space shuttle, which was designed to carry components that would go up to low Earth orbit, be assembled, and we now have a structure on low Earth orbit that is as large as a football field from goalpost to goalpost, or 120 yards. That's how big it is. People don't realize how big it is. People don't realize the research that is going on. Not only with somebody like Mark Kelly's twin brother, Scott, that went up and lived for a year so we could study the effects, long-term effects of weightlessness on the human body, because when we go to Mars, hopefully we're not going to have to go with conventional technology that'll take us 8 months, then you got to land and then stay on Mars until the planets realign, and that could be as much as a year, and then come back. We're not ready for that. Hopefully we're going to sprint with faster propulsion, but even so, it's going to be long periods in weightlessness unless we create some kind of centrifugal force, like a revolving spacecraft that would give some effect of gravity. But nevertheless, we need to figure out all of this. And we've got this platform up there north of $100 billion, and it's there. Abandoning this incredible orbiting laboratory where they are doing research, when we are on the cusp of a new era of space exploration, would be irresponsible at best and probably disastrous. It's pretty clear that the proposal to end the funding by of ISS by 2025, that wasn't a NASA decision. That was an OMB decision, Office of Management and the Budget, which traditionally has been the bane of NASA's existence because they've wanted to run the space program. And so it was a political decision. And as far as this committee is concerned, and I can tell you as far as this senator is concerned, that proposal is dead on arrival. Because, as Ted says, this is a bipartisan outfit that we're looking at this in a way of bipartisanship. And indeed, this is where you bring together all the players, industry, academia, everybody, except the White House's Office of Management and Budget. And they are the ones that then focus on a random date, and it's the wrong way to approach a transition from the ISS. Now, one day, low Earth orbit is going to be filled with commercial space stations. And it's going to be filled with other platforms used by NASA. And in lunar orbit, there are going to be commercial platforms, and there's also going to be a NASA platform. And that NASA platform will be a means by which ultimately we go in what has been set by the president as a goal to go to Mars in the decade of the 2030s with humans. So it's going to be a combination of government and non-government commercial activities. But it's not fair to NASA or to industry to force a transition based on an arbitrary date. That decision should be based on factors like NASA's research requirements and the readiness of the industry to take the lead. We need to listen to our scientists and the experts at NASA. They have made it clear that NASA will continue to need access to low Earth orbit for astronaut training, technology development, and research. So today we have skilled people at Kennedy, at Johnson, indeed across so many centers, working on the ISS and on commercial crew and cargo, and these are some of the only people in the world who know how to keep people alive in space. And if this plan to prematurely end the current ISS program moves forward, I fear that NASA's expertise in these critical areas, expertise that we're going to have if we're going to Mars with humans and safely return, that expertise is going to be lost. The good news is that NASA's ISS transition report indicates that the space station has plenty of operational time left, at least through the end of 2028 and probably beyond. And we have time to continue the critical research taking place on the station. And we have time to keep training astronauts to live and work in space as they prepare for those long duration missions. And we have time to develop a robust commercial market in low Earth orbit. NASA should be focused like a laser on getting commercial crew up and running right now so that American astronauts can once again be launching to the station from the Cape. NASA ought to be laser focused as it's getting ready within 2 years to launch the largest, most powerful rocket ever, the SLS. NASA shouldn't be off on these rabbit trails having to defend a space station that ought to be there for all of the things of preparation. Once Boeing and SpaceX are regularly transporting crew to the station, it's going to enter into a golden era, and we'll see just how valuable the research platform is. And it makes good business sense to take full advantage of our investment on the ISS, just as it makes common sense to maintain our nation's leadership in the ambitious space endeavors. And remember, I said just a minute ago, the largest rocket ever, a third more powerful than the Saturn V that took us to the moon, is right around the corner from its first test flight. We want to keep NASA focused. The ISS is an unprecedented accomplishment that continues to serve humanity and maintain the U.S. global leadership in space. And so I look forward for this committee to continue to exercise its jurisdiction over this issue. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Nelson. You know, I would note there are issues on which Senator Nelson and I disagree, but on this issue, the importance of the ISS and a resolved commitment to not wasting the billions of dollars we have invested in that asset, Senator Nelson and I are on exactly the same page. Now, welcome each of the witnesses to present your testimony.
Why couldn't we agree on a lot of other pages?
We've got hours left in the afternoon. Our first witness is Mr. Bill Gerstenmaier, who serves as the Associate Administrator for Human Exploration and Operation at NASA. Our second witness is Mr. Paul Martin, who serves as the Inspector General at NASA. We'll now recognize Mr. Gerstenmaier to present your testimony.
Thank you. Thank you very much for allowing me to present in this important hearing on examining the future of ISS administration perspectives. The ISS has accomplished amazing things and transformed the way that we see human spaceflight. Crews have lived continuously on ISS for almost 18 years. The ISS has enabled groundbreaking research that benefits us all. The space station has helped NASA prepare for deep space missions. The space station has allowed us to maintain a leadership role in international spaceflight. The Space Station International Partnership has developed voluntary standards, such as the International Docking Standard, that could transform spaceflight for decades to come. These standards will allow anyone to be part of spaceflight by designing to these standards. The cooperation of the ISS partners is amazing and serves as an example of a diverse community working together for common goals. Lastly, the ISS has enabled innovative U.S. companies to reinvent the launch industry. Further, private sector developed crew transportation systems with the aid of NASA are about ready to go fly. With all these amazing accomplishments from the ISS, it is only fitting that we take time to seriously plan for the transition of ISS and low Earth orbit. NASA is preparing to secure the nation's long-term presence in LEO by partnering with industry to develop commercial orbital platforms and capabilities that the private sector and NASA can utilize after cessation of direct U.S. federal funding for the ISS by 2025. To be clear, NASA is not abandoning low Earth orbit. We must ensure the right pieces are in place to maintain an operational human presence in low Earth orbit, whether through a modified ISS program, commercial platforms, or some combination of both. We are asking industry, academia, and others through a series of funded studies to provide ideas for utilizing the unique properties of space and creating commercial opportunities. We will work with the Space Council and the Department of Commerce to help with the transformation of low Earth orbit. We have also proposed funds in the 2019 budget that help support this transition. NASA looks forward to working with Congress, stakeholders, other government agencies, researchers, private industry, and our international partners on the future of ISS and low Earth orbit to ensure that the U.S. maintains our human spaceflight leadership. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Gerstenmaier. Mr. Barton.
Thank you, Chairman Cruz, Senator Nelson, and thank you for the opportunity to discuss the future of the International Space Station. Over the past 5 years, the Office of Inspector General has issued 13 reports related to the ISS, including reviews on NASA's efforts to maximize onboard research, manage contracts with private companies to fly cargo and crew, and maintain international partnerships that fund almost 1/4 of the station's annual expenses. My testimony today is informed by these past reviews, but draws primarily on findings from a forthcoming OIG audit that assesses NASA's progress in maximizing utilization of the ISS to accomplish its human exploration objectives. This report, which we plan to publicly release in a few weeks, will also examine the challenges associated with continuing ISS operations after 2024, as well as the status of NASA's plans for the station's eventual decommissioning and deorbit. For the past 20 years, the ISS has served as a unique platform for humans to learn about living and working in space, but a platform that costs NASA between $3 to $4 billion annually, or about half of its human spaceflight budget. The President's 2019 budget request proposes ending direct federal funding of the ISS beginning in 2025, and a March report outlines NASA's plans to become one of many customers of a commercially operated station or other privately owned low Earth orbit platform. In my remarks today, I offer 3 observations about the administration's admittedly high-level plans for the ISS post-2024. Observation 1. Based on our work, we question whether a sufficient business case exists under which private companies can create a self-sustaining and profit-making business using the ISS independent of significant government funding. From our perspective, it is unlikely that a private entity or entities would assume the station's annual operating cost, currently projected at $1.2 billion in 2024. Such a business case requires robust demand for commercial market activities. Candidly, the scant commercial interest shown in the station over its nearly 20 years of operation give us pause about the agency's current plans. Observation 2. The amount of savings NASA may realize through commercialization of the ISS may be less than expected, given that significant expenditures, particularly for crew and cargo transportation for NASA-sponsored flights to LEO, coupled with ongoing civil servant and infrastructure costs, are expected to continue past 2025, even if many activities transition to a privatized ISS or another commercial platform. Consequently, any assumption that ending direct federal funding frees up $3 to $4 billion beginning in 2025 to use on other NASA exploration initiatives is wishful thinking. That said, unless the agency receives a substantial increase in funding or can dramatically reduce costs, it will be hard-pressed to continue supporting ISS operations under its current model while attempting to fund other initiatives such as the Lunar Gateway, a lunar orbit and moon landing, and a crewed Mars mission. Observation 3. One obvious alternative is to extend ISS operations under the current regime, which from a technical standpoint is doable, given that the station's infrastructure and critical equipment are or soon will be certified to at least 2028. Our recent audit work determined that research for at least 6 of 20 top human health risks that require the ISS for testing and 4 of 40 technology gaps will not be completed by the end of 2024. In addition, research into 2 other human health risks and 17 technology gaps are not scheduled to be completed until sometime in 2024, meaning that even minor schedule slippages could push their completion past the station's planned retirement date. Finally, at some future point, whether in an emergency or because its useful life has ended, NASA likely will need to decommission and deorbit most or all of the station. NASA estimates a controlled re-entry of the ISS will take up to 3 years to execute and cost approximately $950 million. However, NASA has not finalized such a plan or developed the necessary capabilities to safely deorbit the station in an emergency. In whatever time remains, NASA must redouble its efforts to maximize the station's potential. And the sooner Congress and the administration agree on a path forward for the ISS, the better NASA will be able to plan. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Martin. Thank you, gentlemen, both for your testimony. Mr. Gerstenmaier, where did the 2025 date to end federal support for the ISS that's cited in both the ISS transition report and also the President's budget request, where did that date originate?
It originated in the administration.
Did it originate in OMB?
I don't know specifically where it came from, but it came from the administration and discussions about picking a date collectively.
So the date did not come from NASA?
We didn't pick a particular date. We talked about criteria, as you've seen in the transition report and other things. We didn't see the necessity of picking a specific date within the agency, but as part of the administration, we came to the conclusion that picking a date would prompt a serious discussion.
The NASA Transition Authorization Act of 2017, as you know, required NASA to submit the ISS transition report to Congress not later than December 1st, 2017. NASA was 3 months late in submitting that report, which was in direct contradiction to federal law. How many drafts of the ISS transition report were prepared before the final report was submitted to Congress on March 30th, 2018?
I don't have a specific number, but we go through a pretty iterative process of putting the report together with lots of comments from a variety of folks, so there was numerous iterations of the report placed together. I think part of the reason was the complexity of the report. If you look at the requirement language in the bill, there was a lot of information required, and we did our best to pull together all that data, and frankly, we missed the December date on our own just because we couldn't get the information put together and written down in time to make that December date.
Is it correct that NASA sent at least 2 drafts to the administration, both of which were rejected?
I don't know, I'd have to go check on the specific number. I would say they've never been rejected. They get sent over, we get comments back, we iterate back and forth on the comments, and that occurred after the December deadline. It occurred this year.
On February 20th, 2018, Senator Nelson and I together sent a letter to NASA requesting, quote, all preliminary versions of the ISS transition report as described in Public Law 115.10, including any drafts of the report that had been delivered to OMB or the National Space Council for review. To date, that request has not been complied with. Does NASA intend to comply with that request?
Let me take that question for the record, and we'll deliberate and see.
To your knowledge, is someone in the administration specifically blocking NASA from providing those documents?
There's no specific blockage. I think we just need to discuss amongst ourselves what the benefit is and what's in those versions of the documents and see if they're helpful or not in the discussion moving forward. Many of the comments will reflect what actual debates within NASA itself, where we had lots of discussions back and forth about what should be in a document, what shouldn't be in a document, et cetera. Some of those things we consider somewhat pre-decisional, where we'd like to have that free debate within the agency. We think it's important for us to have open dialogue within the agency where we can disagree with each other and not be subject to external review. So for some of those reasons, we'd like to hold some of those back, but I'd like to meet with our teams and the legal folks, and we'll get together and determine what the right approach is.
Well, and let me be clear, we're not asking for internal documents within NASA. We're asking for any drafts that were submitted to OMB. So presumably once a draft was submitted to OMB, NASA had resolved the internal questions and was submitting something for approval. And it is my concern that considerations other than the merits of the science drove this decision-making process. And so the letter from Senator Nelson and me was not a request for NASA to assess how helpful it might be or not to have those drafts submitted to OMB turned over to us. It is rather for Congress to make that determination. Let me ask a different question on the merits. Mr. Gerstenmaier, as a scientific matter, is the ISS capable of operating beyond 2025?
Yes.
How long do you believe we can safely operate the ISS?
We've done a look at the structural integrity and the major components through 2028, and it looks very viable through 2028. The current maintenance on station is fairly low. We just did a spacewalk today to repair some things and move things forward, but that's predicted. I think we have a good operational life at least through 2028 and possibly a little bit further beyond that. We just need to continue to watch station, continue to maintain it. The IG calls out in their report components we need to watch and upgrade and maintain, but the teams are doing a good job of doing that and keeping it in good operational case and capability. What we don't want to have happen is where we're spending more time doing maintenance than we are doing research. And at that point, then the utility of station starts to diminish, and we have not seen that yet. Station is very viable, at least through 2028.
Page 6 of the ISS transition report states, quote, among the benefits beyond the prospect of lower operational costs for an LEO platform, shifting focus to industry can additionally reduce the infrastructure burden on NASA, as has already been demonstrated at NASA facilities at Kennedy Space Center, Johnson Space Center, Stennis Space Center, and Michoud Assembly Facility. If the policy as described in the ISS transition report is carried out, how will the infrastructure of the Johnson Space Center be reduced?
I think what the report is referring to is it's talking about a way we can reduce the infrastructure costs for NASA programs. So in the case of the Michoud Assembly Facility, we were able to bring some commercial companies in that could use the facilities at Michoud in parallel with our operations. So then they would share some of the facility use, some of the utility bills, some of the support personnel. There were multiple users in the facility of which NASA only had to pay now a portion of some of that infrastructure cost. So that's what that report is referring to. And so when we think of space station, if we have multiple users in space, where NASA is just one of multiple users, then that cost of infrastructure and say cargo flights or crew flights, those can be shared between the government and the commercial sector, and then that lowers the cost to the government. And that's what's implied by that infrastructure discussion. So it's not a reduction in personnel, it's an efficiency that's gained. And so at the Johnson Space Center, if some commercial companies could come in and do operations in the facility or in the center, where they share some of the overhead of maintenance and lighting and utilities, then that lowers costs for NASA. So that was what the intent of that discussion was in the report.
How would you project that mission control at JSC would be impacted?
Again, we see mission control continuing at JSC as we bring a commercial crew online. Boeing has chosen to operate CST-100 out of the Johnson Space Center. We also see the gateway activity that we do around the moon. That will be operated out of the Johnson Space Center. So I see mission control continuing into the future as we move human presence into the solar system, carrying the traditional role that the Johnson Space Center has carried in the past.
So as I mentioned in my opening statement, NASA hasn't fared well in the past when decisions were made to prematurely end major programs like Constellation and the Space Shuttle. While there were a host of valid reasons for needing to transition away from the Space Shuttle, the reality is the program was phased out before an alternative was established. This decision created a gap in capability for our national space program and has made NASA reliant upon Russia to transport American astronauts to and from the ISS. As you can see from this first chart here, between 2006 and 2018, the price that NASA has paid the Russian government to secure seats to transport American astronauts to and from the ISS has increased from roughly $21 million to over $80 million, a cost increase of 372%, or a $60 million increase in just 12 years. As you can see from this second chart, the consequence of having this gap in capability means that American taxpayers will have sent roughly $567 million to the Russian government to transport our astronauts to and from the ISS, which comes out to roughly $3.5 billion between 2006 and 2018. And it's also worth noting that commercial delivery systems cost will be 2.4 times more than the Space Shuttle. What do you see as the consequences in terms of capability lost if federal funding is phased out for the ISS in 2025?
Again, I think, you know, we have some principles that we carry within human spaceflight, and one of those principles is the continuity of human spaceflight. And we believe keeping a continuous presence in human spaceflight is important, and continuing to keep a leadership role in spaceflight. And I think Station needs to have that leadership role. What we're describing here with this activity is we think now is the time to do the planning to make sure that we have a good transition from the predominantly government-funded space station we have today to where we have now commercial space stations, other activities in low Earth orbit that we can continue to use to keep our leadership role and to keep human presence in space. So we're thinking more of a transition rather than a stop and then a start. As you've shown through your graphs and the plots here, it's not good when you stop and then you start at some TBD point in space. So what we're trying to do through this activity and through the transition report is establish some principles, which you can read in the report. We're trying to go out to industry, ask industry what the government can do to help them take a better role in low Earth orbit operations, and how we can make an effective transition where the government doesn't have to be the sole payer, and U.S. industry can do new things in inventive ways in space. And we've seen some positive examples of that with both commercial crew and commercial cargo. I think there's some real advantages of the private sector doing some things in innovative and creative ways. I think we can do the same thing in low Earth orbit. We need some time to do that. We would like to begin that activity in earnest now, and then we can see how that works through the period of time and then figure out when the right time is to transition Station.
So as you know, China has announced that it intends to have its first permanent manned space station ready for service in 2022. Do you have any concerns that China may be putting itself in a position to fill a leadership vacuum in low Earth orbit if it's the only country with an operational station beyond 2025?
I think we need to be aware of that consideration and factor that into our planning as we go forward.
Okay, final question for Mr. Martin. Both the ISS transition report and the President's budget request list 2025 as the date in which direct federal support of the ISS will end. Has your office looked into where that 2025 date originated, and if not, will you commit to examining that question?
We have not looked into where the 2025, and respectfully, we will not look into it's a policy issue by the administration. Unless there's some evidence of any nefarious outside influence on that decision, it really is a policy decision, much like the previous administration had decided to focus on an asteroid retrieval mission as opposed to a lunar return. And so really the Inspector General's office, we look at, we don't deal with policy, we're not management. We look at programs once they've been decided on by the Congress and the administration, and then we find fault in those programs.
With all due respect, Mr. Martin, it is not a policy decision when it is directly contrary to federal statute that has been enacted into law, the NASA Transition Authorization Act of 2017. And I believe that date directly contradicts statutory language that was passed unanimously by both houses of Congress. Senator Nelson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This senator has been through a kabuki dance on the issue of OMB trying to control NASA for years and years. And it's an equal employer, equal opportunity employer, because it's both Democrat and Republican administrations. And here we go again. Mr. Martin, I'm going to have most of my questions for you because Mr. Gerstenmaier is in a very difficult position. He has to mind the fact that there are those folks up there in OMB who think they're running NASA. And so he has to be careful what he says, even though he's one of the best NASA managers that has ever come down the pike. But I do want to ask Mr. Gerstenmaier, and I think it will make the point here. When Senator Kay Bailey Hutchinson and I authored the NASA authorization bill of 2010 that set NASA off on the dual course of a commercial industry of launchers, as well as NASA being able to get out beyond low Earth orbit and explore, and thus the course that we are now seeing come to fruition with the launches of 2 commercial rockets carrying crew within the next year, and then the big rocket as the first of the Mars program, maybe in a couple of years. All of that set the table so that it would be worthwhile for commercial companies to come in and develop rockets and spacecraft in order to get humans to and from the International Space Station, which also would allow us to stop paying the Russians all of those monies that we paid over the years, even though they've been a reliable partner. So, given the fact that this was a business model for SpaceX, for Boeing, and others to come to go to and from low Earth orbit, specifically the space station, what do you think this is going to do to their business model if suddenly there's not an International Space Station there?
And it's envisioned in the the way we've come down to legislation is that there would be potentially other commercial platforms in low Earth orbit that could be serviced by both of these companies, both by the cargo providers and also by the crew transportation providers. So the idea was, instead of having a sole government space station, there would be a government station, potentially other smaller commercial space stations in low Earth orbit, of which this industry, the supply industry of transportation, would be able to service. So that's the discussion we've had, and that's the thing we're trying to pursue, to see if there's a market that supports that, and to put the details of how that works. And we're going to ask industry and ask others through a series of studies here fairly soon to give us their business plans, to give us their understanding of what they see as the revenue potential in low Earth orbit. I think we're starting to see a real interest in low Earth orbit from commercial companies, where there's just an inkling that there can be some revenue generation there. That's a starting point, that's a tipping point, and what we need to do is we need to figure out a way we can help enable that through the Commerce Department, through NASA, to get that vibrant economy there, and then again we'll see this commercial sector take activity in low Earth orbit. So we have to walk between figuring out the right time for the government station to start ramping down and the private station to start coming in place.
And you do not have any assurance that that business model is still there to support their commercial rockets. Is that correct?
There's no absolute assurance that that business model is there, but we can construct a transition plan thoughtfully amongst all of us that can help lower the risk to acceptable levels, where that's the right risk for the private sector and it's the right risk for the government to get the capabilities we need in low Earth orbit.
Mr. Martin, what was it that you were talking about, 6 of 20 human risk, that requires research on the ISS? 6 of 20 human risk, you say, have been identified on the station?
Yes, sir. NASA has a very robust program to look at, from their human resource program, to look at what are the key health and human performance risks that can be detrimental to astronauts in long-duration spaceflight. And they have a very colorful chart that maps out when they would get these risks to a successful point where they could either mitigate it or they've decided to accept the risk. And according to NASA's own figures, 6 of the 20, the mitigation activities and the research on those health and human performance risks will not be completed by 2024.
And Mr. Gerstenmaier, do you think that substitutes, if they could be put up, commercial stations by 2025 would be available? Do you think that's possible?
I think it's possible for those items, and what we need to do is make sure that those unique facilities and capabilities are present in the commercial activities. So we can actually make sure that they have the ability to investigate those particular areas.
You know, right now, NASA is paying for the transportation costs to and from the station on commercial cargo and soon to be American astronauts to go to and from. Do you think that the commercial companies could pick up that burden if NASA were to abandon the ISS?
Again, I think it's, as we've all seen, one of the largest costs for having a capability in low Earth orbit is the transportation cost. So we need to watch that transportation cost. Again, I think the model is, if there's revenue generation by the private sector, then they can pay for some portion of that transportation cost. And what that percentage is, I don't know, but we can work that out. And then the government gets a reduced cost for the activities that the government needs. So then the government pays for the services it requires and what it needs. So there's a transition phase. So it doesn't go from full government funding to no government funding. I think there needs to be a transition phase. And that's what we've kind of alluded to in the transition report, of how we discover and how we build that right transition model to make sure we don't lose this capability that we've acquired with Space Station.
Not just the transportation costs, but the $1.2 billion per year that Mr. Martin indicated just to keep the station alive. So commercial companies would have to pick that up. And that, you're talking about commercial companies suddenly taking such a large bite of the financial pie. It's possible they might choke on it, wouldn't they?
And again, I think we have to be careful as we think about the next platform in low Earth orbit. The space station, as you described in your opening remarks, is amazing in terms of size and complexity. These commercial stations could be dramatically simpler, dramatically smaller, and potentially the operating costs for those and some of the transportation costs can be reduced some amount by having a smaller capability. So we've seen some things now where the cargo providers are doing an after-mission activity with their cargo vehicles. They actually fly an extended mission after they're done delivering cargo to station. That could serve a function of a space station to be crew tended in a sense, not even in orbit for a permanent amount of time and return. So I think we have to open up our thinking about what that new commercial station is and recognize that having a commercial entity take on the full cost of ISS doesn't make sense, but is there another model that still can give us the capability we need for reduced cost and maybe a different manner, an innovative way of achieving it? And that's what we want to start exploring with companies in the near term, because at some point station will wear out, station will no longer be supportable, we're going to have to deorbit station. We want to make sure that event doesn't occur without us being prepared to look at a transition to another activity in low Earth orbit that can keep this continuous presence moving forward.
Well, I would suggest, Mr. Gerstenmaier, that I can speak on behalf of Senator Cruz and myself and say that as you do all of this planning, you also ought to plan for the alternatives that the station is going to stay alive until 2028 and even beyond. And as you look at your different scenarios, I would recommend that you do that because this committee is going to require that, you as part of the administration. Mr. Martin, does the ISS transition report adequately consider the risk of ending the ISS program in 2025?
We don't believe, based on our work, that it does, Senator.
What are your impressions of the transition report and the manner in which it was influenced by the administration Reid OMB?
Right, Senator, I can't speak to the latter part of your question because we have no knowledge of the input that OMB had or didn't have on the language. But looking at the report, and again, based on the OIG's work, the report is, apart from describing a high-level framework and using words, dropping words like robust economy in low Earth orbit, we think that a lot of the conclusions or observations are overly optimistic in nature, particularly with the ability over the next 6 years to generate a sufficient economy in low Earth orbit to pull off this plan. So we have serious reservations about it, sir.
Of the $3.5 billion that NASA spends on ISS operations, transportation, and research each year, roughly $1 billion goes, as you have already indicated, $1.2 billion, to operating and maintaining the station itself. The ISS transition report makes it clear that NASA will continue to need access to low Earth orbit even as we move to exploring Mars. The report says NASA is going to keep paying for research and for transportation to low Earth orbit. Yet it doesn't say how transitioning to a privately run space station or platform will actually save money. If a commercial space station exists by 2025, it won't be free. How, Mr. Gerstenmaier, will using commercial platforms in low Earth orbit save NASA money?
Again, it has to come from the things we described. There needs to be some ability for the commercial sector to generate revenue in low Earth orbit on their own, so they have a revenue stream separate from the government, or other government agencies contribute to the funding. That lowers some of the cost, or the cost is shared now across a community rather than just NASA paying for that cost. The other way would be is if we back off on some of the capability and we have less functionality in low Earth orbit, such that it costs less to maintain that functionality in low Earth orbit. Those would be two examples that we need to investigate and see which ones of those have the potential of yielding the benefit that we describe or we would like to try to get by making this transition.
So, Mr. Martin, I ask you, based on the work of the Office of Inspector General, is the commercial industry ready to assume the cost of operating and maintaining the ISS?
We don't believe so, and we think we had some specific concerns with the transition report. If you look on page 27, it talks about an STPI study that assesses the economic viability of a commercial low Earth platform. Some of the assumptions that this study uses are belied by the chart that the chairman just put up. The operating assumption in that study was the cost of an astronaut transportation in low Earth orbit was $20 million. Last time I looked, it was closer to $84 million per seat. In addition, on page 29 of the transition report was an interesting comment about venture capitalists that were contacted by the study writers to assess the economic viability. No venture capitalists that they spoke with for this report would invest in a commercial platform in low Earth orbit until there was much more clarity on revenue and costs.
On the basis of what you just said, if I were trying a jury trial, I would say, Your Honor, the plaintiff or the defense rest. Are there areas in which NASA could save cost under the current ISS program?
Myself or Mr. Gersten?
Mr. Martin.
I'm sure they are, and they've consolidated contracts. They've moved from 2 fixed-price contracts with its main contractor, Boeing. There's lots that they've done over the past 5-10 years, and our hats are off to the managers at NASA for that. And I'm sure there's additional efficiencies that they could identify in the coming years.
And then there's the question of demand. NASA's goal is to be one of many users of commercial space stations. But right now, I don't see who those non-government users are. Mr. Gerstenmaier, do you expect who would be the one that would join NASA for LEO services on a commercial space station?
Again, I think if we look at what's going on station today, we don't see a single user that's going to come in and take a majority stake in the operations on station or have a majority activity. But what we're starting to see for the first time is we're starting to see a variety of companies find benefit that they can gain by doing research on board station. So the pharmaceutical companies, of which you're well aware of, have been doing research into various drugs on station. They've been using animal models and plant models to go look at various drug efficiencies, and some of those are having very interesting and positive benefits. The fact that the human genome changes slightly in space is also very intriguing to drug companies and other folks. There's some very novel new treatments that may come out for disease that we face that are coming that companies could gain revenue from. We're also beginning to start to see some manufacturing companies go actually fabricate some material in space. There's some fiber optic material that's being manufactured today that again potentially has the potential of being a better fiber conductor of optical transmissions on the Earth. So again, I would say it's too early to say that there's any one company, any one discipline, but there's a variety of areas and disciplines that show promise. Our job, along with Commerce and others, are to figure out ways that we can enable that industry to continue to investigate and see through their entrepreneurial and their innovative understanding that they can generate a case to generate revenue, and then at that point they can start picking up some of the burden that we carry in space. But again, I think it's a slow, stepwise process.
Thank you for that comprehensive answer, and if you would, since you have just well made the case for extending the ISS, would you provide to the committee examples of all those things in the research that are going on that you just referenced for the committee's perusal, and probably the committee's wanting to talk about it because the general public doesn't really understand just some of the research that is quite dramatic, as you said, on pharmaceuticals that is going on. And since we have a vote in progress, Mr. Chairman, I think I'll stop right there. And I thank the witnesses, thank them for their expertise, and I think that the purpose of this hearing has been accomplished.
Thank you, Senator Nelson. We just heard the defense rests, and I will say my friend Senator Matlock would receive a directed verdict if this were indeed a courtroom.
If you were the judge, I'm sure.
I'm going to ask just a couple of very brief questions, and we're going to wrap this hearing up. Mr. Gerstenmaier, a minute ago you were having a discussion with Senator Nelson about pharmaceutical research. If a billion-dollar drug is created due to the research on the ISS, what claim would NASA have to the intellectual property, and what share, if any, of the revenue would NASA receive?
Again, we can, that's a pretty detailed answer that comes from that, and we can go look at that. We've been trying to look at the advantages of providing, if a company operates with NASA, typically we own the intellectual property rights if they participate and develop something in our facilities. But if they put in the majority of the work, all the innovation comes from their side, all the creativity comes from their side, then they should rightfully have ownership. So we've been trying to look at ways that we could amend or clarify what our ownership of intellectual property rights are. Typically, we have those rights. We typically don't ever grab those rights from someone that does research, but we own those rights. That's held some people back from doing research on station because there's a significant amount of work that these companies will have to invest to get that revenue. They're going to have to not only make the discovery on station, but then they're going to have to take it through maybe 10 years of federal drug agency trials and to actually get a pharmaceutical that's on the market. So they'll make a significant amount of investment in that it's probably not appropriate for us to go capture some revenue from that because they've earned that through the money they've put in place. So we'll work with that and we'll see how that looks. But I think in general, we would like to have them, if they put the revenue in, put the time in, put the creativity in, that's their intellectual property that they should be able to use.
So does NASA have any agreements in place for sharing revenue that could be utilized to lower ISS costs?
Not in that direct revenue sharing sense, no.
Well, I think that may be ripe for further discussion, and I look forward to working with you on that. Let me just say finally, I want to thank all the good men and women that work at NASA, the incredible scientists, the incredible leaders, astronauts, brave men and women that are leading our country's space program. We are grateful for your service. As chairman of this committee, I view it as a responsibility that I take very seriously to stand up and fight for you. And I know Senator Nelson views that responsibility with the same gravity. And so I thank you both for your testimony. The hearing record is going to remain open for 2 weeks. During this time, senators are asked to submit any questions for the record. And upon receipt, the witnesses are requested to submit their written answers to the committee as soon as possible. And with that, this hearing is adjourned.